All right.
Oh, okay. Just to give you an overview, we're going to be going through some presentations covering some of the course material. Then Christina is going to be covering, Christina and Professor Clark are going to be covering information on new social movements. Then we're going to do some concept review of kind of like some concepts that maybe people were a little less comfortable with or familiar with for the midterm exam. And then we're going to be doing kind of a review for you of strengths and weaknesses of the midterm exam and how we can improve going into the final exam so that you feel confident that you can do well on the final exam. Okay?
I'm not sure. What do we need to do to be projected?
Oh.
No, there's
Oh, it's on.
It's there. It's fine.
good.
No, we don't have to.
I already messed with the lights, so at least it's spotlighted.
All right, so what we are presenting over is the Bowling Alone reading by Putnam.
A quick overview. So Putnam says that the United States once had an enviable society, a civic society, and it was because of civic engagement. He mentions Tocqueville and how when he visited, he was impressed at like Americans' ability to make democracy work. And this democracy was, the way it worked, it was because of all the different associations that were occurring. However, Putnam says that there has been a decline in civic engagement, and there is a lot of evidence to prove that the vibrancy of American civil society has declined over the past several decades. And the decline of civic engagement ultimately leads to a less vibrant democratic society. So he also mentions social capital, which is the governing concept of this work, and it refers to like connections, networks among people, especially when they're in coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. It's called Bowling Alone. He uses participation in the sport of bowling as a metaphor for the critical issues.
So Putnam mentions that civic engagement is declining. So he explores multiple ways that it is and different ways of measuring that it has been. One of them is through the political aspects. He used national election data from the 1960s to the 1990s and found that Americans are voting less now, or up into the 90s and continued into today. Less people are going to like a town hall meeting or a community meeting in general. Government distrust has increased since the 1960s into the 90s. Reasons he mentions for that are scandals like Watergate or the Vietnam War were unpopular. So he relates that to the potential increase in distrust, but he also relates just the general disconnect from politics where people don't really care anymore, so they just aren't getting involved to understand why they should trust the government and whatnot. But he goes on to clarify that it's not just a political issue, like it's not a problem only of Americans aren't getting out to vote. He goes into things like church going is down as well. As Tocqueville said, America is one of a very church nation. So as a sort of fundamental factor based on what Tocqueville believes. The decrease in church going is pretty significant as well. Labor union membership also dropped during that time. At this point, he's not looking for reasons of why these dropped. He's just laying out things that happened, as well as the PTA and just general clubs that people are joining, the Women, Boy Scouts, Red Cross, all saw the same decrease in membership. He saw these through the General Social Survey. He used that to gather his data and compare it across time. It was taken, I believe he said, like 6 times through this time range. And then, of course, the title of the book, the writing is Bowling Alone. So he mentions bowling leagues, how more Americans than ever are going out and bowling. That's increased by 10%, but leagues have decreased by 40% over that same time. So people aren't going out and seeing their friends and like bowling in this group together. They're either going alone, maybe with a family, maybe with a few friends. And he finds that that's decreasing people's engagement with each other, decreasing the spreading of ideas, things like that.
Okay, so there are 4 contributing factors to the decline of civic engagement. The first of which is women in the workplace. He mentions that over the last decade, the number of women who have moved out of the house and into paid employment has increased. And he also mentions that it's a big part of why the average weekly working hours of the average American has also increased. So by women joining the workforce, they have less time to be a part of these organizations, like PTA, League of Women's Voters, Federation of Women's Clubs, and Red Cross. And when they move out of the house and spend more time in the office, men have to assume responsibility. Well, he says that one of the potential reasons is that men have to, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that I'm sorry, I got really mixed up.
Men's association decreased as well.
Yeah, so this is potentially because women spend more time in the workplace and less time at home, and he says that potentially this means that men have to pick up things at home, but he overall concludes that it has to be something beyond women's revolution that is contributing to the decline. The second one is increased mobility, which he uses as, he says that residential stability is associated with greater civic engagement, and he compares it to this concept of repotting, which is like repotting of plants, and whenever a plant is repotted, its roots are disrupted, and it takes time for this individual plant to regrow its roots and start it. So, however, there is data that shows that residential stability has also increased since 1965, which would disprove the original hypothesis of increased mobility being a big contribution to it.
The next contributing factor is just demographic transformations across America in general. So you look at like the 1950s and 60s, there's a lot of middle class families with children, and these are typically the highest rates that we see people joining secondary associations. So as you go into the 90s, there's less married people, there's more divorces, there's people are having fewer children, and people have less money to go out and join the bowling league. They can't afford it as well. So that can really account for the smaller association numbers. And then things like supermarkets replacing a corner grocery. You're coming to a place where you're not seeing your same people every day, you're not interacting with the same people, sharing ideas and communicating with each other there as well. And then like online shopping, it takes that to another level completely of you're completely individualized, sitting anywhere, not talking to anyone, not sharing any ideas, not being engaged civically. And then he really has a problem with television.
I got a phone to pick.
The problem with television is it like allows you to spend your leisure time alone, and it maybe even probably is a better way, a more enjoyable way for us to spend our time. But in a social utilitarianism concept, you're not spreading ideas, you're not engaging with the community, and overall society is hurt through television and individualized leisure time. That's the loss of social externalities. And then that's also increased with more technology advances like DVDs, or now streaming, replacing going out to a movie theater and things like that. So he notes some counter trends as well, like not association membership isn't completely declining across all areas in America. So something he points to things like Sierra Club, National Organization for Women, and the AARP especially. But he notes that these are tertiary associations, as he calls them. So something like a bowling league, he would call a secondary association, where you're going out. It's not like your family is not a direct job or something, that you're committing time to it, you're going to it, you're seeing people, you're enjoying your time there. With these clubs, you're sending in maybe a membership fee, you're getting a newsletter, you don't necessarily know the other people that are in your association. The most you might have in common with them is you both carry an AARP card. You don't know anything else, you don't care necessarily. So these aren't fostering social connectedness, despite like the AARP's immense political power to bargain with political policies. The next is nonprofit associations. He says this might be the biggest counter-argument to his theory, because things like the Mayo Clinic are much more popular now. Many more people are involved, but they're just simply not the same thing, according to Putnam. He said most secondary associations are nonprofits. However, like a nonprofit doesn't just make it a secondary association. Like they're not even generally related in his theory. That makes sense. We can come back to it. There's more questions. And then this is a pretty big point I found personally. Support groups are much more relevant now, things like Alcoholics Anonymous. 40% of Americans report to be affiliated with some type of support group, but Putnam actually uses this as like a pretty critical case to prove his point that this is an individualistic type association where you're just doing things for your own benefit in the presence of other people. It's not the same thing as a bowling league where you're sharing your ideas and collectively becoming better citizens, I guess. It's just something for yourself, which follows the trend of a more individualistic society.
Okay, he goes into good neighborliness and social trust, where he says that the proportion of Americans that socialize with their neighbors more than once a year has dropped dramatically. And at the same time, the percent of Americans that socialize with friends that are not in their neighborhood has gone up, which can also imply that there's more like workplace relationships or just any outside of the neighborhood, which means that social trust and, social trust and civic engagement are strongly correlated, and by less good neighborliness, there's like less social trust, leading to how it would affect social capital in the long run.
Well, hold on 1 second. So something that like I forgot to cover earlier is like, why should we care about this at all? Like, what does it matter that social engagement is like becoming less? Putnam states that lack of engagement in communities, like ideas aren't spread. I've covered that pretty well. But also just more engaged communities are seen to have better schooling system, faster economic development, lower crime, and more effective government. So I mean, that's really why any of this matters, and like why he's feeling the need to write about it at all. And it's not just like a direct personal view that he has on the problem.
Okay. He also mentions what is to be done about all of this. He doesn't really go into much about, aside from just like listing them. So he says sorting out dimensions of social capital, like understanding the impact of electronic networks, not romanticizing the 1950s, and explore how public policies can impact social capital.
So with the 1950s, I mean, what he's referring to there is the small middle class, the husband, wife, 2 kids the man goes out to a bowling league, the woman stays at home. Like, he's not saying that that's the best thing for society, but he's noting that at these times, associations were higher, and we had the higher civic engagement during those times. But not necessarily that we need to revert back to that. So this article in general produced a lot of feedback, both negative and positive. So some of the commentary on it.
Yeah, at the end of the one we had, there's a commentary, and she takes a lot of his points and it's just, she doesn't agree at all. One of the quotes I got was, Putnam seems to place both the burden of civic engagement and responsibility for its collapse on the non-elite class. Where this seemed most relevant for me where she said that where he says that there's a loss of trust, that he mentions that the percentage of people that trust the government go down. She says that he blames like non-elite parties, as I just said in the quote above, but she says that obviously like politicals and opinion elites will trust the system more than the non-elites because the system works for them and has made them rich and famous. Another thing that she says is that bowling leagues came out of working class and middle class as a like escape from their homes and escape from their lives. And it's not from, and she says that she kind of reverses his thought process. She says that bowling leagues going down and bowling has become more of a happy activity that you do with friends, family, and etc., as opposed to just like sitting down with your colleagues and drinking beer. That's it. Yeah, that's my overview.
We had a second view. There's a second commentary that was in agreement.
Scott Heller.
Scott Heller
Yeah.
was in agreement with the art as well. Personally, going into this, I assumed I was going to agree with it because I assumed that people are more individualized now. I wasn't entirely convinced by his evidence and reasoning. And I wonder if that's more because it was written in the 1990s versus now. And I wonder if it were written again now, if there would be more relevant evidence to sort of what we're experiencing, to be more persuasive in this matter. That's all we have. Are there any questions or anything about this?
What's your take on the argument?
I agreed more with her and her commentary on it.
With Paul Kappa?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why?
Mostly, I mean, I put here the things that stood out to me the most where when I was reading, these are the things that I was thinking about the reading. There was another, he just seemed very, like, it was like some obvious statements that he made that would seem like counterintuitive in my opinion, but she mentioned it, which is why I put it on here.
Could you just like explain a little bit more like her argument with like the whole non-elite versus elite class thing?
Well, he, like I said, he seems to blame the non-elites for like this like loss of trust, which comes from a bunch of different factors, but one of them is how the percentage of people that say that they trust the government in Washington has like decreased dramatically, and these people seem to be like the non-elite or like the lower class, and she says, well, obviously this would be the case because they're the ones who suffer from the system that's currently.
Yeah, she mentions things like, it's the middle class who's going out and joining a bowling league. So sort of the undertone of his argument is saying, well, the middle class needs to pick up their game again. They need to get out and do these things. But for him, as a tenured Harvard professor, like he doesn't have time to go out and join a bowling league because he's got important things to do. But you poor people, you need to make sure our society's good again.
Like she says, like the rest of us are just couch potatoes, as she put it.
So it's placing undue burden on an already disenfranchised class is essentially the argument, yeah.
Any other questions?
Can you review the idea about the secondary associations and the nonprofits?
Yeah. So he doesn't, throughout his article, he doesn't like give a definition for what a secondary association is. He just goes into the tertiary associations and like how those aren't related. And then he just kind of pulls nonprofits out of nowhere, saying this might be the counter argument to it. And from what like I've gathered from it is someone might make the connection that volunteering at the Mayo Clinic is the same as joining a bowling league, but his argument is just that they are completely separate things. Like being in the Mayo Clinic is just not giving you the same social engagement that joining a bowling league will be. Does that answer it? Yeah.
Would you mind repeating why is this so important? Why?
Yeah. So it's important because, as I've stated a few times, ideas aren't spread around a community without these secondary associations for people to come together. And then specifically in the article, he says that more engaged communities produce better schools. They give better economic development. There's lower crime in engaged communities, and there's just a more effective government because people are more involved, sharing their ideas with their politicians to get represented better as well.
Do you represent any data that supports?
No, this was just a claim that, yeah, it's just a claim that he had. He didn't give crime data or anything like that.
All right.
Should
Thank
we-
you.
Okay.
Do you want to lead in with that as a question, as an entry point?
Let's see. Professor, do you have any comments on this point?
Especially about the role of nonprofits with respect, nonprofits in the third sector with respect to Putnam.
One way to frame it is not to say that we need to support or oppose Putnam or a more individualized approach, but that this is one ideal within the U.S. and within other societies, and one is more localistic, neighborly, personalistic, and Putnam is stressing that in his ideal. He's spent a lot of time in southern Italy and has a house there and so forth. Women talking over their laundry in the back alley between homes. In person is his ideal of that. Whereas the Sierra Club, the abstract, the movement, the social movement, these things he really doesn't see as real organizations, and he resists this. But there's a debate going on among others. I've just mentioned one person is Richard Florida, who's attacked Putnam specifically, saying, I grew up in that kind of Italian closed neighborhood and I hated it. I wanted to get away from it. It was in Newark. I wanted cosmopolitanism. I wanted innovation. I wanted freedom to live and think in different ways. And so even though he's talking about the future of the U.S. in similar manners to Putnam, those are two extreme versions. So I'd say rather than you or I or anyone saying you should endorse one or the other, as analysts, we can see neighborhoods, we can see individuals as leaning more toward the one, the localistic, neighborly, etc., or the more highly individualized, and then try to follow out the implications. And so clearly, these are big issues which have been there. These are among the most basic social issues for the last 2 centuries that many people have argued over, including in the last election with Trump and others. But I'll just leave it there and say we can treat, in that sense, I'm sort of doing what we're doing in the scenes analysis. We can see them as dimensions of scenes and dimensions of life, rather than having to say one is right or bad or good or whatever. End of comment.
Okay. Okay, Professor, so I have that table on the screen right now. I think most people can read it, kind of. Letters look small,
you can
but
move up if you can't see
yeah.
it well.
So the point of this here is to try to connect how like progress and history builds up to different associations in society, and how we end up in scenes in the last row here, because then there are some leftovers from different periods that add up, like today. So, Professor, do you want to comment on this, on the table?
Were you going to say any more than that, or that's all you wanted to say?
Yeah, that's all I want to say. I heard you're recording today, and like he knows this so well, like, and he has so many good examples on how people use this. So, yeah, I don't want to interfere there.
Okay, your choice. But
Okay.
that is, we've got different versions, and we want to have time for other stuff later. So, I'm just trying to sort of place a limit on how much I should talk about it, and what's our consensus from the 3 of you as TAs. What's our agenda for the rest of the session today?
No, in the recording, I think he could talk for like 1 hour and something on this. Maybe half an hour.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
30 minutes.
And if we're doing that, did you want to try to have the video version or just the audio? What's convenient for you there?
Okay, we can do video. If you want to see the class.
Christina, we still have one more presentation in addition to our midterm
Oh,
review.
okay.
So I think 20 minutes max.
20 minutes?
20
Okay.
minutes.
Okay, 20 minutes. No, it's fine. Okay. So 20 minutes and we're okay like this. Just the audio.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
All right. What in this context? That is, this context is in a sense the last two substantive sessions of the course on ethnicity and then on new social movements have many individual concepts which are good for you to take away, to use in life, to think about for exams and papers, as well as, you know, writing memos to the mayor when you're working for him in the future. But you can also try to say, how do the pieces fit together? What are the bigger contrasts? And so one is what I just mentioned of the idea of the sort of local, closed, ethnic, Italian neighborhood that Richard Florida hated, but Robert Putnam sees as the ideal of the Southern Italian integrated, or at least relatively integrated style. And debates over these persist in part because we live in a society surrounded by models from different sources. And so that's one way to integrate the new and the old social movements, the political parties. That is, everything which is shown in this table on the screen, we still are living with in one way or another. If we ask how possibly can we be living with the feudal arrangements around us, what's the answer to that in the US? What's the deepest still cleavage as evidenced by voting and by a number of other survey items? Race. Why is race a cleavage? Because of its linkages to slavery. And where does slavery come from? The feudal order. So even though we're supposedly living in a post-industrial, iPod society, we still are surrounded by a feudal cleavage called race. And they're both there, and they can be more active or less active depending on whether you're playing the trombone and you're trying to play in a jazz club downtown, and they say, you're not authentic, sorry, you can't play in this band. Or if you're in an Apple store and you're saying, how should I do this or that? That is, the same people in slightly different contexts will activate or deactivate how these different things work. So the point is, all of these are still with us. More active, less active, and even though obviously we're not surrounded by the true feudal background, we can't understand the power of slavery and the power of the efforts to overcome it without having a sense of how overwhelming and hierarchically dominant the feudal order was, in the sense that it lasted for generations. You could not walk away, or at least not legally. If you ran away, you could be killed or imprisoned in different forms, or sent back or sold or whatever. That is, you and your children and your children's children were the property or the responsibility of the master. And the master took care of people working on the farm. They would go fight wars together in groups within armies and so forth. Okay. You have a sense of that. If we push on, I'll just say a few words about each of these, but not much about the ones which are more familiar to you. The industrial order obviously was stressed in the work of Marx, Lenin. The continuing class conflict themes around social conflict, class voting, class organization, owners versus workers is the cleavage, and the key point is it stresses conflict and it stresses work. It does not stress lifestyle and leisure and other things which are stressed below. So I'll proceed on down because you know that's more or less. Keep my screen here so I can keep on the same page as you. Civic organizations we've just been talking about. I won't say any more. I mean, they're the key in Tocqueville's analysis, and I'll skip on. I'll make the next critical point is how do these things begin to link together? And political parties are critical. The major analysis of opportunity structure, which is one of the three big concepts we talked about in the reading, was highlighted especially in the Italian versus the German cases when the environmentalists tried to join the socialist and communist parties, and they were refused because the parties didn't want them. So as the political opportunity structure was closed, the environmentalists in Germany and Italy became terrorists for 4 or 5 years. They blew up trains and took hostages, they assassinated people and so forth. A few years later, when the party said, okay, yes, we do want you after all, they stopped their terrorist tactics and they became coalition partners and traded deals like I won't say exactly like everyone else, but they drastically changed their style. So in that sense, the political opportunity structure defined largely, especially outside the US, by political parties is critical in defining how important are unions versus civic organizations versus parties, and how do these different cleavages get legitimately represented. And the parties may say, no, that's not legitimate. We don't want you at all in the political game. Okay, so just the quick point there is the U.S. is very unusual internationally, and that's one reason it's excellent to have non-U.S. participants active in the class pointing this out to us. The next is the
Okay. If they can see it back,
they
can see it on the screen.
The new social movements we've talked about pretty well and extensively in the last session. What I'm trying to do here is simply locate this in a continuing framework where all of these are going on. For instance, in the Occupy movement, you could find representative of all of these organizations and activities. You could find race-based organizations. You could find strikingly organized standard political party representatives. You could find civic organizations. The Occupy movement was historically one of the first to begin to feature a drastically different mode of organizing, where you did not have one dominant leader, one dominant structure, but you had these competing structures. So as this was much being discussed and debated, and people were trying to make sense of it, I and some others, were especially active when it came to Chicago. That is, there were about 160 cities that had these Occupy movements in the couple of years after Wall Street. And in Chicago, it was meant to be, I've forgotten there were 3 big meetings. It was where I think the Federal Reserve was meeting and an international organization, etc. It was very, very high profile, and people said this is going to be another Democratic Party, 1968, and Chicago is the place for conflict. And so the city, the state, the national government brought in thousands and thousands of troops who were in these black uniforms, and they lined every street where there was any sort of activity going on. On the other hand, I walked around, biked around, talked to people, took videos for days, as did several students, and the amazing thing was the degree to which many, I would say 40%, 50% in many of these activities, were people who were taking photos of each other, who were posing, who were drinking, who were talking, who were having fun. That is, it was a scene in the sense of, hey, let's go out and have a good time together, surrounded by all of this stuff. The activist, politically activist students from the USC, by contrast, were very earnest, very angry with this sort of stuff, and they said, I'm disgusted. I don't want to go there anymore because these people are not really committed to anything except having a good time. So now that's a slight overstatement, but the point is the diversity, the lack of coherence led many to say that this sort of organizational pattern was not geared to active implementation of political success in a serious way. Whether or not that's true, I'd say, was very much a local specific and issue specific response. That is, if we go instead to Kiev, to Cairo, to Hong Kong, to Rio, movements of this sort have been very, very important. And the most two obvious ones are Kiev and Cairo, where with just about 2 weeks of activity, the president, the legally elected president, resigned and said, I do not have the support of the people. I will give up my office and you can hold a new election. That happened amazingly in ways that never would have happened 10 years before. People like Hitler, so you've got to kill me. I'm a strong man. So a strong man never resigns until he's dead. And so in that sense, the style of leadership has drastically changed, with citizens becoming far more active and important and visible, even in the minds of people who used to be considered very strong men, military dictators in places like Egypt or Latin America, Korea, and so forth. Okay, so how to make sense of this? I'd say by looking at each of these types of organizations. I didn't comment. Just let me comment briefly on the last two. The new social movements we have not talked about here. They are discussed in the Kalman Clark book. And the key point is, in contrast to, say, the Sierra Club or Amnesty International, is that these are not organizations. These are more like the crowd in the Occupy movement itself. And there are many people who simply walk in, and people may organize in the sense of making a puppet together. And so you have things that are highly visible, great video, television material, and ideally will create emotional engagement by the followers. That is, in contrast to the past, when people were paid off with jobs or contracts or cash, how do you get people to come out now? Emotion, ideas, and feelings become much more important resources to mobilize than they were even in the time of the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so new social movements. Then the last line is scenes, and again, you read about scenes. The point here is to place them in this kind of comparative context. Not to say that everything is now a scene, but to say that a scene can be an Occupy movement, a way of looking at an Occupy movement, but where we may also see feudal order being expressed and fought out in language and context and so forth, where we may see class conflict, where we may see unions, where we may see all of these things fighting, trying to define, in some cases, the dominant style, in other cases trying to change it, but most of all, that because scenes have so much of a voluntary potential entry and exit, that people can leave and just walk away, then the rules become much harder to impose in a strongman sort of way than they are in earlier contexts. So in a sense, it also says scenes are not implied to be everything. They're only implied to be part, a more emotional, more buzz-oriented, more engaging, exploratory kind of set of activities, even if they're in a workplace. So you may have people in a workplace, and you can say a workplace is based on money, it's based on payment, it's based on jobs, but it's also based on morale, on emotion, and whether you hate the boss or feel the boss is is charming and etc. And you love to sing karaoke with them, whether you're in Asia or in Montreal. Okay, that's the quick overview. I think you can see the linkages pretty specifically to Christina's talk about cosmopolitanism versus localism. You can see it with the new social movements of trafficking of organizations for the environment, which we'll be talking about further, and similarly in terms of ethnicity, these each imply, in a sense, a different conception of ethnicity, of where and why ethnicity takes on importance. It's usually because it gives you a job or gives you a political linkage of some sort. And so ethnicity without these other things tends to move away or get redefined in terms of its dynamics. And Dahl pointed that out very well in terms of the interpenetration. All right, I'll stop there, and if we have a little time for question or discussion, fine.
Any questions? Yes.
Sorry, could you elaborate more on what you were saying about like ethnicity?
Could you come a little closer, please, or there's someone who can repeat the question either way.
Yeah, go up to the laptop.
If you're way far away and it's not easy to come forward, or whatever you want.
Could you elaborate more on like what you were saying about ethnicity and how it gets kind of like redefined?
Yeah, I used Dahl briefly as that analysis was so well presented by two of the students. Of showing how the Irish and the Italians, for instance, were linked in turn with the two parties in New Haven, and how ethnicity, or just examples in Chicago, cities considered local. Why do these vary locally? And that is, the scene or the presence of different structural contextual factors transform the salience of ethnicity and the dynamics of ethnicity. And Dahl did this in contrasting the two political parties in New Haven. If we think, say, just of cases that go further than New Haven, Chicago is even stronger than New Haven, and has deliberately created 50 small wards to preserve ethnic solidarity. At least that's what it was initially. By contrast, Los Angeles has had a handful of very, very large electoral districts, and many of them were only chosen for people to be elected at large, or that was more true in places like Houston and Dallas, but sometimes you get a mix. You maybe have four at large and then 4 constituency elected council members. So the point is, the legal structure can try to reinforce and enhance ethnicity or not. And in general in America, the ideal, as Dahl discussed it, was to get rid of it. On the other hand, once some of these strong ethnic political leaders became empowered, they wanted to preserve it. So Daley One was the archetype, maintaining ethnic parades in each of the wards, of having jobs and contracts appointed, using ethnic groups to build social solidarity and reinforce the ethnicity of the individual members. And if, for instance, if you could only get a job working for the city government, if you were recommended by your ethnic group leader, that says a lot about the importance of ethnicity in Chicago's traditional style of working, versus other places where this was considered completely corrupt. And so from the 19th century onward, roughly by the early 20th century, roughly 40% of American municipalities, mostly middle-sized and smaller, had legally nonpartisan elections, did not permit any parties to be on the ballot, and had a style of so-called reform government where you did not play up ethnicity at all. It was toned down in California is the extreme version. Follow up on that or others?
No? No one? Okay. Okay, it seems like we don't have questions, so.
Should we move on to our last
Want to
student
move on?
presentation?
Yes, okay.
Or
Okay. Yes. So, Professor, do you want to stay online
Sure,
here
I'll
so you
stay
can?
on and listen, but just listen in the background, that's fine.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, who's going to present?
Okay,
by the way, the spreadsheet is on Canvas, so you can always see it through the
Yes,
Canvas.
I'm going
If
to
it's
add it
through
to Canvas.
It's already on.
Yeah, and we'll
Oh,
add.
it is?
Yeah, I just put it on.
Okay.
Hey, way to go. So this presentation is going to be about those short identification concepts from the midterm exam to kind of help solidify our working definitions of them.
All right.
Does it have the right input? I think that's VJ1.
This one.
No, wait. This is 2. These are 2. Sometimes you just have to take it out and put it back in.
I could just log on to my computer.
Do you want to go out of your full screen?
Okay.
Christina, I can't hear anything. Are there people talking to you?
Technical
Oh.
difficulties.
Yes, no, not yet. Yes, we're trying to get the
See what
computer
slide
to
mode?
work.
It might have gone into mirror view.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Do you want to say something while we try to make the computers work?
Any more Q&A on any of these issues?
There it is. We got it.
Oh, okay, we got it.
It just did mirror view.
Okay.
So where's the full view? Bam.
Wonderful.
Okay, there you go.
All right. So I'm Alex. Very concerned about everyone's performance on the midterm. I was hoping I could help out here because I'm an altruistic person, not because of any misgivings on the midterm on my own end. All right. So we have a couple, 7 midterms, I believe. So we have the Golden Straitjacket, World's Flat Conception of Globalization, Division of Labor, Extent of the Market, High Social Liberalism, Fiscal Liberalism, Humanities, Producer Services. I'm basically just going to give a slide for each one and a couple quotes from various readings, which also explain the concepts. I hope it's fairly straightforward. I don't plan to spend all too much time on each one because I actually think most of the terms are fairly straightforward. So the first one we have here is the Global Straitjacket. This term seemed to alternate. I wasn't actually sure which one to put. So this is coined by Thomas Friedman in his book, The World is Flat. This refers to when countries sacrifice a certain degree of political and economic autonomy to certain international institutions, such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc. This is mostly done in order to foster economic growth and facilitate trade with other nations. Usually it's poorer countries which are more willing to go along with this just because they need the stimulus, but nonetheless we obviously have dominant countries within it as well. Friedman thinks that this is basically making politics less relevant. The main currency that countries are using to exchange between one another is not just bilateral negotiations, but rather just trade. There's less political baggage when we're talking about countries dealing with each other. But Professor Clark here thinks that this degree of success is overemphasized. You tend to see, or at least recently, a lot of political misgivings within certain countries about clinging on to these institutions. You can specifically see it, I guess, with the new wave of nationalism going on with Trump. You see renegotiating agreements like NAFTA. Americans in particular that seem to be many misgivings with these institutions.
Can you just hold on that,
Sure.
on that last slide?
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to use it because we're about to talk about this. So this is great because in a brief slide, this is essentially exactly what we're looking for in the short answer. So we'll get into this a little bit when we shift after your presentation to talking about the midterm answers. But in general, students spent way too much time on the short-term identification, which should be that, short and to the point, and way too little time on the essays, when really it should be like a 20%, 80% kind of division of your time instead of the opposite, okay? So we're just looking for these 3 elements essentially. Identify the author associated, explain the term and why it's important. Why it's important is that it's done in order to foster economic growth. And then contextualize it within global local politics. Superb answers might reference a critique or how this topic is discussed in ongoing conversations in the literature. But really, you know, you're not going to give us bullet points, but minus the bullet points, just add in some punctuation, and you've got yourself a really great and to the point specific answer. The added bonus would be when you're using specific terminology to cite, which we'll also discuss. But thank you.
Yep. All right. Moving on to the quote. I couldn't actually find a quote from the book itself, but I found one wiki quote that seems to sum it up fairly well. Golden straitjacket is the defining political economic garment of globalization. The tighter you wear it, the more gold it produces. That's Friedman's thesis. The more you sign on to this international global trade organizations, the more success you're going to have as a country in this new globalizing age. All right. So next slide we got is the world is flat. Specifically speaking of the book, this is Thomas Friedman. For him, this is a way to conceptualize a convergence of social and economic forces which have created a more unified globe in the 20th and 21st centuries. Specifically, he uses the concept of triple convergence to illustrate this change. He identifies 3 factors. Just as a side note, this is a slide from the Flat Earth Society, which I remember. So the first one is the internet, which I think our generation is very fond of or understands this fairly well. It basically allows people to trade with one another instantly. Basically makes it easier to make partnerships. According to Friedman, it's his contention that the opening of the Berlin Wall, Netscape, workflow, outscoring, offshoring, etc., etc. The net result of this convergence was the creation of a global web-enabled playing field that allows for multiple forms of collaboration without regard to geography. Second factor he cites is not simply technology, but also the people that go along with it to manipulate it. Specifically, he's referring to a large cadre of managers, innovators, business consultants, business schools, IT specialists, CEOs, and workers who are able to use this. There's been a large influx of these very specific specialized laborers in the 20th and 21st centuries, also multinationals, corporations. The third also is just new markets coming into play, specifically in countries like China, India, Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, specifically, I think mostly from the 80s and 90s on. He says that 3 billion people who had been frozen out of the field suddenly found themselves liberated to plug in and play with everybody else, specifically because of their dealings with liberalizing their own markets to create more free trade agreements, etc. So the next term we have is division of labor, famously explicated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He cites this as one of the fundamental principles of modern capitalism. It's one of the main reasons why global trade and productivity has expanded so rapidly in the last 250 years. Basically, this is when work is divided up into smaller tasks among multiple laborers on assembly either on the assembly line or in small trade organizations or even just small companies. This causes increased productivity and efficiency, goes hand in hand specifically with industrialization. The argument that the specific example that he uses to cite this is the example of manufacturing of a pin. Previous generations, we would just have individual pin manufacturers who would manufacture all the components of a pin at once. But as you started having division of labor, you would have multiple laborers working on that exact same thing. But creating individual components of it. This will basically speed things up and eventually bring down costs. All right. Here's a quote, a long one. Division of labor, so far as can be introduced, occasions in every art, proportional increase of the productive powers of labor, separation of different trades and employments from one another seems to have taken place as a consequence of this advantage. I don't really want to read the entire quote, but you can see it up here if you want. Going on with this concept is the concept of the extent of the market. This is fairly self-explanatory on its own. It's basically how many people you can get to sell your product. This is a continuation of Adam Smith. Division of labor specifically is something which is limited by the extent of the market. If you have larger markets, you can have a more advanced division of labor. It means more advanced products, cheaper products, etc. As markets grow due to globalization, division of labor expands with it. When there's more demand for products, there's more opportunity for industrial expansion and specialization. Okay. Quote, when the market's small, Smith explains the logic fairly straightforward right here. When the market's very small, no person can have any encouragement to dedicate himself entirely to one employment for want of the power to exchange all that surplus part of his own labor, which is over and above his own consumption for such parts of the produce of other men's labor as he has occasion for. So basically, when the market's small, there's really no incentive to split up the labor. He just does it himself and creates a very small market. All right. Moving away from economics, we have the concept of high social liberalism, low fiscal liberalism. This specifically refers to what Professor Clark refers to as the new political culture of the 1990s, which is really part of this neoliberal consensus, which seemed to develop around the 1990s. Think of Milton Friedman, Margaret Thatcher, all that stuff. It basically is something which characterizes most global cities nowadays. If you want to be competitive, they become characterized commitments to individual degrees, significant degrees of individual autonomy, LGBT rights, tolerance of other cultures, free press, with limited municipal and governmental intervention in trade, taxes. Like I said before, to be competitive, you should follow this model. I specifically chose a picture of Hong Kong here to illustrate this concept because it seems to be one of the better examples of that. Very high dedication to free markets and freedom, although that's obviously decreasing as China gets this whole moment. So this is a quote from Professor Clark himself from Transforming Political Systems and Political Culture. Clark argues that it's not that it's social liberalism which ultimately leads to this sort of fiscal conservatism. You see liberalism and jobs, and more freedom there. You want more of that less expansive role of government getting in the way of it. So there's pressures towards creative innovation. The rise in social liberalism is complemented for some by a rise in fiscal conservatism. The pressures toward creative innovation in the private sector is shared in the public sector. People seeing the jobs they also want from their government, which encourages competition via decentralization of programs from national governments, etc. So, like I said, once you have more freedom in people's give people more individual freedom in their jobs, etc., you eventually see the government playing less of a role in doing that. He also continues here with some examples of new political culture.
Can you go ahead and read that out?
You want me to read it? Sure.
Yeah.
Combination of social liberalism with fiscal liberalism was initially seen
Conservatism.
Conservatism. What did I say? Sorry. Was initially seen as an impossible mix, mere hypocrisy. This changed more and more with such leaders like NPC mayors, like Clinton, Blair, Vicente Fox, and others who visibly sought to implement these joint policies and brought new labels like the Third Way. They were led to productivity improvement and continuing innovation as the main resolution of fiscal and social policy positions.
Can we go ahead and pause here? Is this your last slide on high fiscal?
I got like 3 more.
No, just on high
Yes.
high social. Okay, let's pause here for a second because Christina's going to be showing you all a slide of the distribution of which concepts you all chose for your short concept definition. This was one of the ones that y'all chose the least, suggesting perhaps a slight discomfort with talking about it, or maybe you felt like you didn't have as much of a strong grasp on this concept. So I want to take the opportunity. We've got Alex here, who is the expert on these 7 concepts, and we've got Professor Clark here, who's an expert on high social liberalism and low fiscal
liberalism.
High conservatism, flip-flop there. So is there anything that's unclear to you about this concept? If you were asked on the final exam to give us a nice short-term identification, do you all feel confident that you could do that? Or is there anything that you want to ask either Alex or Professor Clark? Yeah.
Just it's like, if that was the answer, would like a proper response just be, it is basically like, it's termed by Clark like new political culture. It's it's like an example of like 1990s, 1990s new political culture.
Yeah, this is a great.
Many global cities started to follow this trend in which there was like low taxes, low trade tariffs, low trade tariffs, and high social values, and then like that.
Yeah, and then the why of it, right? To be competitive.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's perfect. Explaining the logic of it, and then the like, why is this important, or why does this social process occur? That's great. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. amenities. This is a fairly simple one. This is also a component of the concept of global cities described by Clark. So driving, basically, these are driving factors which influence people to move from one city to another. They can refer to things which are natural, like lakes, mountains, etc., or man-made, like theaters, restaurants, nightclubs, parks. Differing amenities can also target different subgroups, young versus elderly. Young are probably going to be more likely to care about whether a city has a high density of like popular nightclubs and hip restaurants and stuff, whereas the elderly are more concerned with like access to nature and things just generally being quiet, calm.
So this is actually a component that a lot of you were missing as part of your definition of amenities was, like, walk us through. I think it's something that because we talk about it so much, some of you were kind of taking it for granted in your explanation and your definition of it. So really walk us through the components of it, and specifically, you know, this component, it can refer to these natural or man-made phenomena, right?
Big block quote here. Would you like me to read this, or should I just summarize?
You can summarize.
Yeah, it's just basically amenities are just enticements for people entering a city. They're public concerns for many cities in the United States or in Europe. Basically, amenities are the things which policymakers are actively considering in order to grow the popularity of their cities and make sure large enough tax base, etc.
So if you had to give us a sentence that was like, why do amenities matter to the topic of global local politics?
Global local politics.
Yeah.
I guess it would just be that cities are actively like competing with each other, like both on a local level and at a global level of making sure that they can draw.
Yeah, it relates to that question you're highlighting of how to attract talented people, right? Yeah, great.
Finally, we have producer services. This is relatively simple. I don't actually have a quote after this. The document that explains it was basically just saying all this to begin with. It's in contrast to consumer services, which is basically anything that you and I buys for himself, Spotify, subscription, pharmaceuticals, all that stuff. These are
got a question in the back?
Yeah, sure.
Well, this was about amenities, so I could ask it once you're done with the presentation as well. I don't want to rudely interrupt.
Okay, I'll get to you in a second. So yeah, this can be basically anything like legal services, consulting, accounting, etc. Anything which helps streamline production of goods and other services. Think McKinsey, Bain, all those jobs we're all going for, I guess. I don't know. Such firms, at least nowadays, tend to be the critical players in global cities, at least according to Sasson. Things which basically allow these giant multinational corporations to function swiftly and efficiently. They didn't exist maybe like 100 years ago. Yeah, fairly straightforward.
The only improvement I would add to that slide is forefronting, first identify the author and how the author conceives of it, and then walk us through.
My bad.
No, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, what's your question about?
Okay, first of all, I apologize for interrupting your train of thought. Secondly, going back to amenities, Clark's idea appears to be focusing more on cities. Does this leave room for an expansion to focus on greater units, such as states, countries, whatnot?
I mean,
or is it just cities?
I mean, I don't actually know, but it at least makes more sense to me to conceive it in terms of like cities. Like you tend to think of like an amenity as something which is like in a distinct, like closed off place. You don't think about what a country like has as its amenities. Like you don't say you're gonna move to France because there's like a theater there, right? But you say you move to like you move to like a specific neighborhood in like Paris because of its like the proximity of its services and stuff.
Okay, thanks. That makes it clear.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure, that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should take a picture.
Alguém here in case Professor Clark wants to say something? Okay.
Congratulations to
Mic drop.
Okay, so moving on here for the
Yeah,
midterm.
you wanna talk about
No, you go ahead.
the distribution?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the distribution of the grades.
So that's the grade distribution.
So it's mostly between 40 and 44. We had only 100%. And well, it was challenging to read. And maybe we can explain here what we expect for the final.
I've been reading a lot of Bourdieu lately, and so I think there's going to be an emphasis on not taking for granted cultural capital that we all have coming into the exam, and also the expectations of what's expected of you. And so we're going to do everything we can on our end to make the expectations much more clear going into the final exam in terms of what we're really expecting from you, from the short answers on the one hand and from the essay on the other hand. So here, it's hard to read, but I'll call it out. This is like the most answered to the least answered short ID. World is flat, extent of the market, division of labor, golden straitjacket, producer services, amenities, and then the one we just reviewed. So hopefully, if we ask this again, 100% of you in this room are going to answer this one.
And the first one there has 58 answers. So, and then the second 53, 51, and then it goes down to like 38, and the last one here is 7, in case you can see it.
Yeah.
So only 7 people out of 136 decided to talk about it.
This is something to help you with framing too, because going into the final review session, if there are concepts that you feel shaky on, make sure to bring those to us so that we can help clarify them. I mean, luckily, that's also, this is kind of how it shakes out sometimes, and this is why we give you multiple options in case all of you really don't want to answer one of them. And then this is the distribution of the essays.
Some of them I couldn't be sure of what it was because people don't specify which essay they're talking about, but like reading a little bit, I can guess that it was essay 1. So 89 people out of 136 decided to talk about essay 1. It's like, was the question maybe too long? You didn't want to keep reading?
Yeah, we'll get into that and answering the question that's asked as well. So first there was a lot of, the next slide I think deals with that. So first, I think an overarching takeaway is don't spend so much time on the short answer, because I think it has a lot of explaining power for the results that we saw on the midterm exam, where we saw these really in-depth, long concept definitions, and then we saw these really short essays, many of which basically copied and pasted your concept identifications and strung them together into 2 paragraphs. Do not import and copy and paste your concept terms as an essay. It's not an essay, and they should be 2 totally separate components. But again, I think that was a result of running out of time because you all did such lengthy, in-depth explanations of the terms, which you do not need to do in the final exam. Do you want to talk about vague sentences?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a great example. And the theory relates to this, but I have no time, so I'm not going to talk about it. And then, I want to know if you know it. Show off your knowledge in the exam.
And just walk us through the outstanding essays, walked us through the logic of the author's arguments. And it's kind of something we were just practicing as we were walking you through the logic of defining these short terms. That is a mini exercise in kind of the argumentation that comprises a successful essay. So yeah, just like the bare minimum. Yeah, go ahead.
So if we are running out of time, would you rather us pick one thing, really explain it well? Then I didn't say like use 3 authors or examples or something.
Yeah, 3 authors and examples. So for time management, again, highly recommend that in general, it's going to vary by person, but I recommend that you spend 20% of your exam time on the short answer ID. It should be bang, 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 done. And 80% of your time, like an hour, basically, writing up an essay. So part of that, you know, organization and flow was a real issue in the essays. So we highly recommend that you outline the essay first. Your essay must contain a clear thesis statement. So we're going to show you some examples of strong essays and strong short-term identification to kind of show you what we're looking for, so we're not just like talking about it without showing you examples. But you know, it's the type of organization that we're looking for, again, is sort of this traditional essay outline of introduction to the topic. In this paper, I intend to show thesis statement. I will do that using the readings of Clark, Boschman, and Sasson, and then like short overview of what you'll say about each author, and then like 3 paragraphs that are each organized. This is what a lot of you did. You know, if you're discussing 3 authors, you dedicate 1 paragraph to each author. And this goes to what Professor Clark was just saying in class today, the nuance over normativity. You know, sometimes we'll ask you to take a stand, but we're looking for the quality of your critical thinking skills in understanding and thinking about these concepts. And as we've seen in these readings, these are complicated processes, and so we're not looking for you to just give a simplistic, like, this was good or bad statement. So the more that you can add nuance and a complicated understanding of these concepts, the better. So yeah, the bare minimum though that I was starting out to say, you have to say which essay you've chosen, and then you have to answer the question you've been asked. So many of you wrote about that first essay, right? That was every single component of those 3 questions asks you to pick a particular issue. Many of you just wrote about globalization and inequality, and you didn't relate it to a particular issue, like immigration in Italy, you know? So you have to respond to the question that you've been asked. Do you have any other more about that in particular?
No, that's
Okay. Good. For citations, it's open book. Citations are expected. Academic dishonesty issues will not be tolerated. At this point, you're in college, you know how to cite, and especially because it's open book, we're looking for citations. So you need to correctly spell the author's names and their terms, and just, you know, the kind of format we're looking for. Jackson, 2015, describes the origins of the equality debate as blah, blah, blah. For her, the dichotomy between individual rights and collective rights is, quote, completely false and overdue for debunking. I've used a specific phrase from this author, so I'm going to cite it. I could say Jackson, but because I was just talking about Jackson, you know it's Jackson because I've duplicated the year, and then I note the page. Yeah, go ahead.
So like, because of the time constraint and the pressure to like get all this done and just to like get our ideas down, it's sometimes hard to like go through the book and actually find like the quotes that like relate to our ideas. So like, how much do you have to quote?
You don't have to quote a lot, but you know, it just goes to the quality of the essay. We'll show you the essay that got the perfect score. And you'll see, it doesn't have lengthy quotations, but this person prepped for the exam by highlighting her materials well and organizing her notes well, and was able to not only describe the author's arguments broadly, but to pull in that relevant quotation when it's appropriate.
And one more thing, when there are several authors, you need to know how to use the at all.
Yeah, at all. This actually stands for et alia, and that's why you abbreviate it.
Yeah, or and buddies. Right?
Yeah, it means and buddies.
Yes. Like, yeah, there are more rules about like how many last names you have to put. Like maybe if it's 2 authors, you have to talk about the 2. But like if it's 3 or more, you can just use that and say exam time.
Jackson.
Yeah.
Et al. 2015. Like that.
Yes.
Okay.
And that also works for like any essay that you're going to write in this university.
Yeah.
Right?
This is true. Yeah. So we already talked about this, the time management issue. We're hoping to institute a word cap on short answers, just so you don't have to worry about it, just so you can move on. It's really about just succinct and clear definitions that demonstrate your understanding for the short answer. So you don't need mini essays. When I was copying and pasting even the top answer, even the people who got top marks on their short answer identifications, they basically wrote mini essays that amounted to an entire page when I cut and pasted it into a Word document. We're looking for like 3 or 4 sentences for the short answer, okay? So yeah, this was reiterated in Alex's presentation, but just 3 and only 3 parts to the short answer. Identify the correct author, briefly and correctly define the term and relevant specific elements. So for example, you know, the triple convergence would be an example. And then link the term to important issues. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a couple of examples just so you can see. Okay, so Addie, can you all, should I make it bigger?
Yeah.
Okay, just 1 second. Okay, so again, her short answers are way too long, but
Still bigger?
Still bigger?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it feels so huge.
There you go.
Where's that? I'm gonna make it smaller.
Yeah,
Sorry guys,
little bit.
sorry.
Yeah, that's
Is that good? Okay. Okay, so you've already, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the short answer examples because you've already been seeing from Alex's presentation some great examples. But here, you know, if she's going to bring up a specific term like class politics, she cites it. The year should have been given. Here we have another citation followed by a brief and relevant quotation. That's not expected in the short answer identification, but when she is bringing up specific terms that need to be cited because they were coined by somebody, she does do that.
Let me just say that the final exam you have 2 hours, so it'll
Yeah,
be
you'll
a little
have-
bit better.
Yeah, hopefully time management won't be an issue. Then, you know, extent of the market starts out, the idea of the extent of the market as being a key factor in explaining or influencing economic growth is employed by numerous authors, but one of its first and most famous uses is found in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And then gets into a lot more detail. It's later employed by Marxist theories. Okay, so now we're gonna move on to her essay and the structure. All right, so first, we've got a nice, clear identification of which topic she picked. Then we have a nice, broad introduction that contextualizes the topic that she's chosen. Ride-sharing has grown tremendously in recent years, and Uber is a household name for most urban dwellers in cities around the world. While this has potential to undermine local tax industries, its potential benefits outweigh its risk. So right there, she's already answered the question. She was asked to frame it in terms of a proposal that she's bringing before the city council, and she does do that. She says, for these reasons, the city of Chicago should permit ride-sharing companies to continue to function in the city of Chicago. So she's addressed the question of yay or nay already in the first paragraph. She's given us an introduction to what ride-sharing is, and she's given us her thesis argument, which fits within the context of the question, which asks her to present before a city council. So then I'm just going to show you, just pay attention to like the topic sentences and transitions, which outline a very clear argument. The ride-sharing economy illustrates on one level what Sasson and Friedman, among others, have predicted as one of the economic impacts of globalization, centralized service firms. And then right here, and here she's doing what I call signposting. She's making it obvious to her reader what she's doing and how her argumentation is working. I argue that the growth of the new political culture in cities like Chicago paves the way for the individualized, non-hierarchical nature of ride-sharing, in contrast to the more hierarchical traditional taxi industry. Again, she was asked to compare and contrast traditional taxi services and that economy with the new ride-sharing economy. Growing market individualism, opposition, and skepticism pair well with companies like Uber and Lyft. I know I'm out of time, so I'll just show you kind of the rest of the signposting of this, and then I can post the other examples to Canvas so you all have them, okay? Finally, one side effect, additionally, Clark and Hoffman, Elazar characterized this in reference to political culture, paragraph about that, specific examples that are cited. The above claim that ride-sharing is more egalitarian is both a reason why I believe it is suited to the political climate of Chicago and to further development, as well as a point of contention. So she actually develops a very nuanced argument. It isn't straightforward. She recognizes how people may contradict her argument, and she attends to those. Anyway, I'll put these examples up. Okay. And please let us know if you have additional questions that you want covered. Yes?
I just have a quick question. The people that presented on the reading, is there any way to get their comments?
Yeah. Alex, can you email me your presentation, please? Thank you. Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. You're welcome to use whatever format you're comfortable with. I would say most people here use MLA or Chicago style. Some use APA. But yeah, just make sure it's consistent. As long as you're consistent, you're good. I'm pretty sure this is review Chicago style. Yeah, everything's fair game, but it just has to be a consistent focus. Yeah, no problem.